So we talked a little bit about how both communist parties came to power. Once in power, Russia and China set about a massive job of creating a communist society. USSR was building the society in the 1920s and 1930s, so between World War I and World War II, and this was under the leadership of Joseph Stalin. In China, the communist state was built under the supervision of Mao Zedong in the 1950s and 1960s, so not until after World War II. For both China and the USSR, the first step was to turn the country into an industrial nation capable of producing lots and lots of things. They wanted to make a society with the production power of somewhere like Britain or the United States or Germany or Japan, but they wanted to bring this industrialization without bringing the massive inequality between rich and poor that existed in these countries. So instead of promoting the values of freedom and individualism like what was happening in the United States and these other Western powers, the USSR and China both promoted the values of selflessness and collectivism. The individual was less important and the collective was more important. So these were totalitarian societies. They were not free countries. Both China and the USSR only had one political party, and that was, of course, the Communist Party. The state controlled the arts, education, and media to make sure everything promoted those values of collectivism over individuality, and that together they were working towards a greater good. So, backtracking a bit, the goal was to create an industrial state. When the Communist parties came to power in China and the USSR, they faced a different situation. When Soviet Union came to power, there was a lot of hostility towards the Soviet Union from the rest of Europe and from the United States, and there were efforts made by Britain and France and the United States to put down the Russian Revolution because they thought communism was a terrible thing. So a lot of outside conflict, and they were basically surrounded by enemies. With China, things were a little different. China's northern border is Russia, so that border is defended. By the time China becomes communist, the USSR has already emerged as one of the world's two superpowers, so China had more help than the USSR did in that sense. In Russia, the revolution happened very quickly. All of a sudden, the Bolsheviks or communists were in control of the country. In China, the communists came to power over a long period of time, small territory by small territory, until they eventually ran the nationalists out of the country. By early 1940, there were 100 million people under the control of the communists, and these were people in the countryside, and the communists had the respect of these people. When the Russians came to power, they were an urban party, and they had no clue how to administer or govern the countryside. So, economically, China had a harder job because they were even less industrialized than the Soviet Union was, and their population was much bigger. But really, both the Soviets and the communists had to build their societies from the ground up. So how did they build these societies from the ground up? One way the communist regimes tried to build their states up was through the liberation of women. Really, they wanted to build societies really fast. They needed bodies to work, and they cloaked this in female liberation. But at the same time, both communist regimes did bring some positive change for women. In Russia, as soon as the Bolsheviks took power, they passed a whole bunch of laws that gave women more rights. This included full legal and political equality, divorce was made easy, women could get an abortion, women didn't have to take the last name of their husbands, women chose who they married. Communism is also a very anti-religious political ideology, and communists in the Soviet Union encouraged Muslim women to remove the veil and liberate themselves in that sense. Women received more education. A lot of this was technical vocational education to give women the skill sets needed to industrialize the country. Similar things happened in China. The communists came to power in 1949, and in 1950 they passed the marriage law. And this law meant that women were given the choice of who they could marry, the right to divorce, widows could remarry, women were given equal property rights to men, and child marriage and prostitution was made illegal. So women were equal to men, and in China, this idea goes strongly against the traditions, specifically Confucianism. If you remember from the beginning of the course, Confucianism talked about harmonious relationships, the idea that a society works well when everybody in the society knows their role and the wife is subordinate to the husband. So, not everybody in China liked these changes. There was often a lot of opposition in the rural areas towards this type of reform. So this patriarchal value is still there. But for both the USSR and China, this was seen as a way of making the country more productive, and women became more productive, became more involved in agricultural production and industrial production. So it's debatable how much of this was ideological, so a true belief in gender equality, and how much was to increase the power of the country. And we have to also take into consideration women are being asked to contribute more, but their traditional role of housework and raising children definitely wasn't divided up evenly. So in a sense, women had a double burden. They were expected to do the jobs of men, but do their old jobs as well. So on top of women's liberation, both China and the USSR introduced land reform and tried to redistribute land to the peasants more equally. And this wasn't communist at first because land was seized from rich, wealthy landowners with lots of land and given to poor peasants as their own property. In Russia, this actually happened in the countryside before the communists even got there. In the upheaval during World War I, peasants in the countryside ran off their landlords and redistributed the land amongst themselves. And when the communists came to power, they just basically okayed this. So spreading the land is much easier in Russia. In China in 1949, it was a lot harder, and the Chinese Communist Party had to take the responsibility for land reform. What they did was rounded up the peasants in rural areas and brought the peasants to confront the landlords, and the peasants had to take their land and animals and redistribute it amongst themselves. Most of the peasants were not educated, they couldn't read, they definitely didn't know anything about Marxism or communism, so the Communist Party played a role in educating the peasants about these ideas of communism. During this process, between 1 and 2 million landlords were killed by peasants as they fought to defend their land. So the first step was land redistribution, taking land away from landlords and trying to make everybody equal. The next step in both Russia and China is what's known as the collectivization of agriculture. The idea behind the collectivization of agriculture was that people wouldn't have their own farms. Everybody would work together on these massive state-owned farms. In China, this process was fairly smooth at first because the communists were the party of the peasants, they had a good relationship with the peasants, and the peasants trusted them. In the Soviet Union, this was a lot harder because the Communist Party didn't have a good relationship with the peasants necessarily. The communists represented the cities and the interests of industrialization over the interests of the peasants. So when the peasants saw the communists coming to take their land, there was a lot of anger, especially among the peasants who were wealthier than their neighbors. So the communists came in and were seizing land and animals, and as an act of rebellion, peasants killed hundreds of thousands of farm animals, ate as much as they could, ate as many crops as they could, and burned the rest to the ground so the Communist Party couldn't come in and take their crops away. The term communists in the Soviet Union gave these wealthier peasants that didn't cooperate was kulak, and some of these kulaks were murdered while others were sent to labor camps. So trying to collectivize agriculture in the Soviet Union was a very messy process, and 5 million people died of famine between 1928 and 1933. Now, in China, there was also a famine with the collectivization of agriculture. Instead of killing 5 million people, the death toll was closer to 20 million. China's population was a lot bigger, and this happened between the years 1959 and 1962. So what's important to know is that collectivization of agriculture in both the USSR and China created massive famines that killed millions and millions of people.